Figures have stylized faces and bodies, dressed in clothing that emphasizes pure cylindrical shapes. They stand solemnly, hands clasped in respect, perhaps a posture expected in devotional contexts. The bold, staring eyes may be related to statements in contemporary Sumerian texts that advise worshippers to approach their gods with an attentive gaze. As with the face of the woman from Uruk, arched brows were inlaid with dark shell, stone, or bitumen that once emphasized the huge, wide-open eyes. The male figures, bare-chested and dressed in what appear to be sheepskin skirts, are stocky and muscular, with heavy legs, large feet, big shoulders, and cylindrical bodies. The female figures are as massive as the men. Their long sheepskin skirts reveal sturdy legs and feet. Sumerian artisans worked in various precious metals, and in bronze, often combining them with other materials. Many of these creations were decorated with, or were in the shape of, animals or composite animal-human-bird creatures. A superb example of their skill is a lyre, a kind of harp, from the city of Ur. To the south of Uruk. This combines wood, gold, lapis lazuli, and shell, sea figs. 7. Projecting from the base is a wood-sculpted head of a bearded bull overlaid with gold, intensely lifelike despite the decoratively patterned blue beard created from the semi-precious gemstone, lapis lazuli. Since lapis lazuli had to be imported from Afghanistan, the work documents widespread trade in the region at this time. Cylinder seals. About the time written records appeared, Sumerians developed seals for identifying documents and establishing property ownership. By 3300, 3100 BCE, record keepers redesigned the stamped seal as a cylinder. Rolled across documents on clay tablets or over the soft clay applied to a closure that needed sealing, a jar lid, the knot securing a bundle, or the door to a room, the cylinders left a raised mirror image of the design incised into their surface. Such sealing attested to the authenticity or accuracy of a text or ensured that no unauthorized person could gain access to a room or container. Sumerian cylinder seals, usually less than 2 inches high, were generally made of a hard stone so that the tiny but intricate incised seams would not wear away during repeated use. Individuals often acquired seals as signs of status or on appointment to a high administrative position, and the seals were buried with them, along with other important possessions. The lapis lazuli cylinder seal in Figure 10 is one of over 400 that were found in excavations of the royal burials at Ur. It comes from the tomb of a powerful royal woman known as Pwabi, and was found leaning against the right arm of her body. The modern clay impression of its incised design shows 2 registers of a convivial banquet at which all the guests may be women, with fringed skirts and long hair gathered up in buns behind their necks. 2 seated figures in the upper register raise their glasses, accompanied by standing servants, one of whom, at far left, holds a fan. The single-seated figure in the lower register sits in front of a table piled with food, while a figure behind her offers a cup of drink, presumably drawn from the jar she carries in her other hand, reminiscent of the container held by the lion on the lyre plaque, CFIG. Musical entertainment is provided by 4 women standing to the far right. Akkad, a people known as the Akkadians, inhabited an area north of Uruk. During the Sumerian period, they adopted Sumerian culture, but unlike the Sumerians, the Akkadians spoke a Semitic language. Under the powerful military and political figure Sargon I, they conquered most of Mesopotamia. For more than half a century, Sargon, king of the 4 quarters of the world, ruled this empire from his capital at Akkad, the actual site of which is yet to be discovered. Disc of Enheduanna, a partially preserved circular relief sculpture in alabaster, excavated at Ur in 1927 by British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, is one of the most extraordinary surviving works of ancient Near Eastern art. Fig. 11. An inscription on the back identifies the centrally highlighted figure on the front, slightly larger than her companions and wearing a flounced, fleeced wool garment and the headgear of a high priestess, as in Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon I and high priestess of the moon god Nanna at his temple in Ur. Enheduanna's name also appears in other surviving Akkadian inscriptions and most notably in association with a series of poems and hymns dedicated to the gods Nanna and Inanna. Hers is the earliest recorded name of an author in human history. The procession portrayed on the front of the disc commemorates the dedication of Enheduanna's donation of a dais to the Temple of Inanna in Ur. The naked man in front of her pours a ritual libation in front of a ziggurat, while Enheduanna and her two followers, probably female attendants, raise their right hands before their faces in a common gesture of pious greeting, example, cfig. 14. Sargon's appointment of his daughter to this important religious office followed an established tradition, but it may also have been the ruler's attempt to bolster his support and assert dynastic control in the southern part of his domain, largely populated by Sumerians. Head offerer, a life-size bronze head, Fig. 12, found in the northern city of Nineveh and thought to date from the time of Sargon, is the earliest known work of hollow cast sculpture using the lost wax casting process. Its artistic and technical sophistication is nothing short of spectacular. The facial features and hairstyle may reflect a generalized ideal more than the unique likeness of a specific individual, although the sculpture was once identified as Sargon himself. The enormous curling beard and elaborately braided hair indicate both royalty and ideal male appearance. The deliberate damage to the left side of the face and eye suggests that the head was symbolically mutilated at a later date to destroy its power. Specifically, the ears and the inlaid eyes appear to have been removed to deprive the head of its ability to hear and see. The stele of Naram-Sin, the concept of imperial authority, was literally carved in stone by Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin, cfig. This 6-foot-high stele memorializes one of his military victories, and is one of the first works of art created to celebrate a specific achievement of an individual ruler. The original inscription, framed in a rectangular box just above the ruler's head, states that the stele commemorates Naram-Sin's victory over the Lalubi people of the Zagros Mountains. Watched over by solar deities and wearing the horned helmet crown heretofore associated only with gods, the hierarchically scaled king stands proudly above his soldiers and his fallen foes, boldly silhouetted against the sky next to the smooth surface of a mountain. This expression of physical prowess and political power was erected by Naram-Sin in the courtyard of the temple of the sun god Shamash in Sippar, but it did not stay there permanently. During the 12th century BCE, over 1,000 years after the end of Akkadian rule, Elamite king Shetraknahunti conquered Sippar and transported the stele of Naram-Sin back to his own capital in Susa, where he rededicated it to an Elamite god. He also added a new explanatory inscription, in a diagonal band on the mountain in front of Naram-Sin, recounting his own victory and claiming this monument, which is identified specifically with Naram-Sin, as a statement of his own military and political prowess. The stele remained in Susa until the end of the 19th century, when it was excavated by a French archaeologist and traveled once more, this time appropriated for exhibition in Paris at the Louvre. Ur and Lagash. The Akkadian Empire fell around 2180 BCE to the Gudi, a mountain people from the northeast. For a brief time, the Gudi controlled most of the Mesopotamian plain, but ultimately Sumerian people regained control of the region and expelled the Gudi in 2112 BCE, under the leadership of King Ur-Nammu of Ur. He sponsored magnificent building campaigns, notably a ziggurat dedicated to the moon god Nanna, also called Sin. Although located on the site of an earlier temple, this imposing structure, mud brick faced with kiln-dried brick set with bitumen, was not the accidental result of successive rebuilding. Its base is a rectangle 205 by 141 feet, with 3 sets of stairs converging at an imposing entrance gate atop the first of what were 3 platforms. Each platform's walls slope outward from top to base, probably to prevent rainwater from forming puddles and eroding the mud brick pavement below. The first 2 levels of the ziggurat and their retaining walls are recent reconstructions. One large Sumerian city-state remained independent. Throughout this period, Lagash, whose capital was Girsu, on the Tigris River. Gudea, the ruler, built and restored many temples, and within them, following a venerable Mesopotamian tradition, he placed votive statues representing himself as governor and embodiment of just rule. The statues are made of diorite, a very hard stone, and the difficulty of carving it may have prompted sculptors to use compact, simplified forms for the portraits. Or perhaps it was the desire for powerful, stylized images that inspired the choice of this imported stone for this series of statues. 20 of them survive, making Gudea a familiar figure in the study of ancient Near Eastern art. Images of Gudea present him as a strong, peaceful, pious ruler worthy of divine favor. Fig. 14. Whether he is shown sitting or standing, he wears a long garment, which provides ample, smooth space for long cuneiform inscriptions. In this imposing statue, only 2 feet tall, his right shoulder is bare, and he wears a cap with a wide brim carved with a pattern to represent fleece. He holds a vessel in front of him, from which life-giving water flows in 2 streams, each filled with leaping fish. The text on his garment states that he dedicated himself, the statue, and its temple to the goddess Jeshtinana, the divine poet and interpreter of dreams. The sculptor has emphasized the power centers of the human body, the eyes, head, and smoothly muscled arms. Gudea's face is youthful and serene, and his eyes, oversized and wide open, perpetually confront the gaze of the deity with intense concentration. Babylon for more than 300 years, periods of political turmoil alternated with periods of stable government in Mesopotamia, until the Amorites, a Semitic-speaking people from the Syrian desert, to the west, reunited the region under Hammurabi. Hammurabi's capital city was Babylon and his subjects were called Babylonians. Among Hammurabi's achievements was a written legal code that detailed the laws of his realm and the penalties for breaking them. See the Code of Hammurabi. Page 39. The Hittites of Anatolia outside Mesopotamia. Other cultures developed and flourished in the ancient Near East. Anatolia was home to several independent cultures that had resisted Mesopotamian domination, but the Hittites, whose founders had moved into the mountains and plateaus of central Anatolia from the east, were the most powerful among them. The Hittites established their capital at Hattusha about 1600 BCE, and the city thrived until its destruction about 1200 BCE. Through trade and conquest, the Hittites created an empire that stretched along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea in the area of present-day Syria and Lebanon, bringing them into conflict with the Egyptian Empire, which was expanding into the same region. The Hittites also made incursions into Mesopotamia, and their influence was felt throughout the region. The Hittites may have been the first people to work in iron, which they used for war chariot fittings, weapons, chisels, and hammers. They are noted for the artistry of their fine metalwork and for their imposing palace citadels with double walls and fortified gateways that survive today only in the ruins of archaeological sites. One of the most monumental of these sites consists of the foundations and base walls of the Hittite stronghold at Hattusha, which date to about 1300 BCE. Local quarries supplied stone for the lower walls, and the upper walls, stairways, and walkways were finished in brick. The blocks of stone used to frame doorways at Hattusha were decorated in high relief with a variety of guardian figures, some of them 7 feet tall. Some were half-human, half-animal creatures, others were more naturalistically rendered animals like the lions at the Lion Gate. Fig. 16. Carved from the building stones and consistent with the colossal scale of the wall itself, the lions seem to emerge from the gigantic boulders that form the gate. Despite extreme weathering, the lions have endured over the millennia and maintain their sense of both vigor and permanence. Assyria about 1400 BCE, a people called the Assyrians rose to dominance in northern Mesopotamia. After about 1000 BCE, they began to conquer neighboring regions. By the end of the 9th century BCE, the Assyrians controlled most of Mesopotamia, and by the early 7th century BCE they had extended their influence as far west as Egypt. Soon afterward they succumbed to internal weakness and external enemies, and by 600 BCE their empire had collapsed. Assyrian rulers built huge palaces atop high platforms inside a series of fortified cities that served at one time or another as Assyrian capitals. They decorated these palaces with shallow stone reliefs of battle and hunting scenes, of Assyrian victories, of presentations of tribute to the king, and of religious imagery. Kalhu during his reign, Assurnaserpal II established his capital at Kalhu, on the east bank of the Tigris River, and undertook an ambitious building program. His architects fortified the city with mud brick walls 5 miles long and 42 feet high, and his engineers constructed a canal that irrigated fields and provided water for the expanded population of the city. According to an inscription commemorating the event, Assurnaserpal gave a banquet for 69,574 people to celebrate the dedication of the new capital in 863 BCE. Most of the buildings in Kalhu were made from mud bricks, but limestone and alabaster, more impressive and durable, were used to veneer walls with architectural decoration. Colossal guardian figures flanked the major portals, and panels covered the walls with scenes in low relief of the king participating in religious rituals, war campaigns, and hunting expeditions. The lion hunt in a vivid lion hunting scene, Fig. 17, Assurnaserpal II stands in a chariot pulled by galloping horses and draws his bow against an attacking lion, advancing from the rear with arrows already protruding from its body. Another expiring beast collapses on the ground under the horses. This was probably a ceremonial hunt, in which the king, protected by men with swords and shields, rode back and forth killing animals as they were released one by one into an enclosed area. The immediacy of this image marks a shift in Mesopotamian art, away from a sense of timeless solemnity, and toward a more dramatic, even emotional, involvement with the event portrayed. Enemies crossing the Euphrates to escape Assyrian archers in another palace relief, the scene shifts from royal ceremony to the heat of battle, set within a detailed landscape. 3 of the Assyrians' enemies, 2 using flotation devices made of inflated animal skins, swim across a raging river, retreating from a vanguard of Assyrian archers who kneel at its banks to launch their assault. The scene evokes a specific event from 878 BCE described in the Annals of Assurnaserpal. As the Assyrian king overtook the army of an enemy leader named Kadiru near the modern town of Anu, both leader and soldiers escaped into the Euphrates River in an attempt to save their lives. Dur-Sharrukin Sargon II built a new Assyrian capital at Dur-Sharrukin. On the northwest side of the capital, a walled citadel, or fortress, straddled the city wall. Within the citadel, Sargon's palace complex stood on a raised, fortified platform about 40 feet high, demonstrating the use of art as political propaganda. Guarded by 2 towers, the palace complex was accessible only by a wide ramp leading up from an open square, around which the residences of important government and religious officials were clustered. Beyond the ramp was the main courtyard, with service buildings on the right and temples on the left. The heart of the palace, protected by a reinforced wall with only 2 small, off-center doors, lay past the main courtyard. Within the inner compound was a second courtyard lined with narrative relief panels showing tribute bearers. Visitors would have waited to see the king in this courtyard that functioned as an open-air audience hall. Once granted access to the royal throne room, they would have passed through a stone gate flanked, like the other gates of citadel and palace, by awesome guardian figures. These colossal beings, known as Lamassus, combined the bearded head of a man, the powerful body of a lion or bull, the wings of an eagle, and the horned headdress of a god. In an open space between the palace complex and temple complex at Dur-Sharrukin rose a ziggurat declaring the might of Assyria's kings and symbolizing their claim to empire. It probably had 7 levels, each about 18 feet high and painted a different color. CFIG 18. The 4 levels still remaining were once white, black, blue, and red. Instead of separate flights of stairs between the levels, a single, squared-off spiral ramp rose continuously around the exterior from the base. Nineveh Assurbanipal. king of the Assyrians 3 generations after Sargon II, maintained his capital at Nineveh. Like that of Assurbanipal II 2 centuries earlier, his palace was decorated with alabaster panels carved with pictorial narratives in low relief. Most show Assurbanipal and his subjects in battle or hunting, but there are occasional scenes of palace life. An unusually peaceful example shows the king and queen relaxing in a pleasure garden, Fig. 20. The king reclines on a couch, and the queen sits in a chair at his feet, while a musician at far left plays diverting music. 3 servants arrive from the left with trays of food, while others wave whisks to protect the royal couple from insects. The king has taken off his rich necklace and hung it on his couch, and he has laid aside his weapons, sword, bow, and quiver of arrows, on the table behind him, but this apparently tranquil domestic scene is actually a victory celebration. A grisly trophy, the severed head of his vanquished enemy, hangs upside down from a tree at the far left. In Neo-Babylonia. At the end of the 7th century BCE, Assyria was invaded by the Medes, a people from western Iran who were allied with the Babylonians, and the Scythians, a nomadic people from northern Asia. In 612 BCE, the Medes' army captured Nineveh. When the dust had settled, Assyria was no more. And the Neo-Babylonians, so named because they recaptured the splendor that had marked Babylon 12 centuries earlier under Hammurabi, controlled a region that stretched from modern Turkey to northern Arabia and from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean Sea. The most famous Neo-Babylonian ruler was Nebuchadnezzar II, notorious today for his suppression of the Jews, as recorded in the Book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible, where he may have been confused with the final Neo-Babylonian ruler, Nabonidus. A great patron of architecture, Nebuchadnezzar II built temples dedicated to the Babylonian gods throughout his realm, and transformed Babylon, the cultural, political, and economic hub of his empire, into one of the most splendid cities of its day. Babylon straddled the Euphrates River, its 2 sections joined by a bridge. The older, eastern sector was traversed by the processional way, the route taken by religious processions honoring the city's patron god, Marduk, Fig. 21. This street, paved with large stone slabs set in a bed of bitumen, was up to 66 feet wide at some points. It ran from the Euphrates Bridge, through the temple district and palaces, and finally through the Ishtar Gate, the ceremonial entrance to the city. The Ishtar Gate's 4 crenellated towers symbolized Babylonian power, Fig. 22. Beyond the Ishtar Gate, walls on either side of the route, like the gate itself, were faced with dark blue glazed bricks. The glazed bricks consisted of a film of colored glass adhering to the surface of the bricks after firing, a process used since about 1600 BCE. Against that blue background, specially molded turquoise, blue, and gold-colored bricks formed images of striding lions, mascots of the goddess Ishtar, as well as the dragons that were associated with Marduk. Persia in the 6th century BCE, the Persians, a formerly nomadic Indo-European-speaking people, began to seize power in Mesopotamia. From the region of Parsa, or Persis, they established a vast empire. The rulers of this new empire traced their ancestry to a semi-legendary Persian king named Ecumenids, and consequently they are known as the Ecumenids. The dramatic expansion of the Ecumenids began in 559 BCE with the ascension of a remarkable leader, Cyrus II. By the time of his death, the Persian Empire included Babylonia, Media, and some of the Aegean islands far to the west. Only the Greeks stood fast against them. When Darius I took the throne, he could proclaim, "I am Darius, great king, king of kings, king of countries, king of this earth." An able administrator, Darius organized the Persian lands into 20 tribute-paying areas under Persian governors. He often left local rulers in place beneath the governors. This practice, along with a tolerance for diverse native customs and religions, won the Persians the loyalty of large numbers of their subjects. Like many powerful rulers, Darius created palaces and citadels as visible symbols of his authority. He made Susa his first capital and commissioned a 32-acre administrative compound to be built there. In about 515 BCE, Darius began construction of Parsa, a new capital in the Persian homeland, today known by its Greek name, Persepolis. It is one of the best preserved and most impressive ancient sites in the Near East. Fig. 23. Darius imported materials, workers, and artists from all over his empire. He even ordered work to be executed in Egypt and transported to his capital. The result was a new multicultural style of art that combined many different traditions: Persian, Median, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Greek. In Assyrian fashion, the imperial complex at Persepolis was set on a raised platform, 40 feet high and measuring 1,500 by 900 feet, accessible only via a single approach made of wide, shallow steps that could be ascended on horseback. Like Egyptian and Greek cities, it was laid out on a rectangular grid. Darius lived to see the completion only of a treasury, the Apadana, and a very small palace for himself. The Apadana, set above the rest of the complex on a second terrace, Fig. 24, had open porches on 3 sides and a square hall large enough to hold several thousand people. Darius's son Xerxes I added a sprawling palace complex for himself, enlarged the treasury building, and began a vast new public reception space, the Hall of 100 Columns. The central stair of Darius's Apadana displays reliefs of animal combat, tiered ranks of royal guards, and delegations of tribute bearers. Here, lions attack bulls on either side of the Persian generals. Such animal combats emphasized the ferocity of the leaders and their men. Ranks of warriors cover the walls with repeated patterns and seem ready to defend the palace. The elegant drawing, balanced composition, and sleek modeling of figures reflect the Persians' knowledge of Greek art and perhaps the use of Greek artists. Other reliefs throughout Persepolis depict displays of allegiance or economic prosperity. In one example, once the centerpiece, Darius holds an audience while his son and heir, Xerxes, listens from behind the throne. Fig. 25. Such panels would have looked quite different when they were freshly painted in bright colors, with metal objects such as Darius's crown and necklace covered in gold leaf. At its height, the Persian Empire extended from Africa to India. From Persepolis, Darius in 490 BCE and Xerxes in 480 BCE sent their armies west to conquer Greece, but mainland Greeks successfully resisted the armies of the Ecumenids, preventing them from advancing into Europe. Indeed, it was a Greek who ultimately put an end to their empire. In 334 BCE, Alexander the Great of Macedonia crossed into Anatolia and swept through Mesopotamia, defeating Darius III and nearly destroying Persepolis in 330 BCE. Although the Achaemenid Empire was at an end, Persia eventually revived, and the Persian style and art continued to influence Greek artists and ultimately became one of the foundations of Islamic art. 3. Art of Ancient Egypt. On February 16, 1923, the Times of London cabled the New York Times with dramatic news of a discovery. This has been, perhaps, the most extraordinary day in the whole history of Egyptian excavation. The entrance today was made into the sealed chamber of tomb. And yet another door opened beyond that. No eyes have seen the king, but to practical certainty we know that he lies there close at hand in all his original state, undisturbed. And indeed he did. A collar of dried flowers and beads covered the chest, and a linen shroud was draped around the head. A gold funerary mask, Fig. Had been placed over the head and shoulders of his mummified body, which was enclosed in 3 nested coffins, the innermost made of gold, cfig. 29, and page 73. The coffins were placed in a yellow quartzite sarcophagus that was itself encased within gilt wooden shrines nested inside one another. The discoverer of this treasure, the English archaeologist Howard Carter, had worked in Egypt for more than 20 years before he undertook a last expedition, sponsored by the wealthy British amateur Egyptologist Lord Carnarvon. Carter was convinced that the tomb of Tutankhamun, one of the last 18th dynasty royal burial places still unidentified, lay hidden in the Valley of the Kings. After 15 years of digging, on November 4, 1922, he unearthed the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb and found unbelievable treasures in the antechamber: jewelry, textiles, gold-covered furniture, a carved and inlaid throne, 4 gold chariots. In February 1923, Carter pierced the wall separating the anteroom from the actual burial chamber and found the greatest treasure of all, Tutankhamun himself. Since ancient times, tombs have tempted looters. More recently, they also have attracted archaeologists and historians. The first large-scale archaeological expedition in history landed in Egypt with the armies of Napoleon in 1798. The French commander must have realized that he would find great wonders there, for he took French scholars with him to study ancient sites. The military adventure ended in failure, but the scholars eventually published richly illustrated volumes of their findings, unleashing a craze for all things Egyptian that has not dimmed since. In 1976, the first Blockbuster museum exhibition was born when treasures from the tomb of Tutankhamun began a tour of the United States and attracted over 8 million visitors. Most recently, in 2006, Otto Schaden excavated a tomb containing 7 coffins in the Valley of the Kings, the first tomb to be found there since Tutankhamun in 1922. The gift of the Nile. The Greek traveler and historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, remarked, "Egypt is the gift of the Nile. This great river, the longest in the world, winds northward from equatorial Africa and flows through Egypt in a relatively straight line to the Mediterranean." Map. There it forms a broad delta before emptying into the sea. Before it was dammed in 1970 by the Aswan High Dam, the lower Nile, swollen with the runoff of heavy seasonal rains in the south, overflowed its banks for several months each year. Every time the floodwaters receded, they left behind a new layer of rich silt, making the valley and delta a continually fertile and attractive habitat. By about 8000 BCE, the valley's inhabitants had become relatively sedentary, living off the abundant fish, game, and wild plants. Not until about 5000 BCE did they adopt the agricultural village life associated with Neolithic culture. At that time, the climate of North Africa grew increasingly dry. To ensure adequate resources for agriculture, the farmers along the Nile began to manage floodwaters in a system called basin irrigation. The Predynastic period, from roughly 5000 to 2950 BCE, was a time of significant social and political transition that preceded the unification of Egypt under a single ruler. After unification, Egypt was ruled by a series of family dynasties and is therefore characterized as dynastic. Rudimentary federations emerged and began conquering and absorbing weaker communities. By about 3500 BCE, there were several larger states, or chiefdoms, in the lower Nile Valley, and a centralized form of leadership had emerged. Rulers were expected to protect their subjects, not only from outside aggression, but also from natural catastrophes such as droughts and insect plagues. The surviving art of the Predynastic period consists chiefly of ceramic figurines, decorated pottery, and reliefs carved on stone plaques and pieces of ivory. A few examples of wall painting, lively scenes filled with small figures of people and animals, were found in a tomb at Hierakonpolis, in Upper Egypt, a predynastic town of mud brick houses that was once home to as many as 10,000 people. Early dynastic Egypt, circa 2950-2575 BCE. Around 3000 BCE, Egypt became a consolidated state. According to legend, the country had previously evolved into 2 major kingdoms, the 2 lands, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. But a powerful ruler from Upper Egypt conquered Lower Egypt and unified the 2 kingdoms. In the art of the subsequent early dynastic period, we see the development of fundamental and enduring ideas about kingship and the cosmic order. Since the works of art and architecture that survive from ancient Egypt come mainly from the god-kings, the Greek historian Herodotus thought the Egyptians were the most religious people he had ever encountered. In their worldview, the movements of heavenly bodies, the workings of gods, and the humblest of human activities were all believed to be part of a balanced and harmonious grand design. Death was to be feared only by those who lived in such a way as to disrupt that harmony. Upright souls could be confident that their spirits would live on eternally. By the early dynastic period, Egypt's kings were revered as gods in human form. A royal jubilee, the Heb-Sed or Sed festival, held in the 30th year of the living king's reign, renewed and reaffirmed his divine power, and when they died, kings rejoined their father, the sun god Ra, and rode with him in the solar boat as it made its daily journey across the sky. In order to please the gods and ensure their continuing goodwill toward the state, kings built splendid temples and provided priests to maintain them. The priests saw to it that statues of the gods, placed deep in the innermost rooms of the temples, were never without fresh food and clothing. Egyptian gods and goddesses were depicted in various forms, some as human beings, others as animals, and still others as humans with animal heads. For example, Osiris, the overseer of the realm of the dead, regularly appears in human form wrapped in linen as a mummy. His son, the sky god Horus, is usually depicted as a falcon or falcon-headed man. Over the course of ancient Egyptian history, Amun, Ra, and Ta became the primary national gods. Other gods and their manifestations included Thoth, god of writing, science, and law, Ma'at, goddess of truth, order, and justice, Anubis, god of embalming in cemeteries, and Batet, daughter of Ra. Artistic conventions. Conventions in art are established ways of representing things, widely accepted by artists and patrons at a particular time and place. Egyptian artists followed a set of fairly strict conventions, often based on conceptual principles rather than on the observation of the natural world with an eye to rendering it in lifelike fashion. Eventually, a system of mathematical formulas was developed to determine design and proportions. The underlying conventions that govern ancient Egyptian art appear early, however, and are maintained, with subtle but significant variations, over almost 3 millennia of its history. The Narmer palette. This historically and artistically significant work of art dates from the early dynastic period and was found in the Temple of Horus at Hierakonpolis. It is commonly interpreted as representing the unification of Egypt and the beginning of the country's growth as a powerful nation-state. It employs many of the of Upper Egypt while striking the enemy who kneels before him with a mace. Above this foe, the god Horus, depicted as a falcon with a human hand, holds a rope tied around the neck of a man whose head is attached to a block-sprouting stylized papyrus, a plant that grew in profusion along the Nile and symbolized Lower Egypt. This combination of symbols made the central message clear: Narmer, as ruler of Upper Egypt, is in firm control of Lower Egypt. Many of the figures on the palette are shown in composite poses, so that each part of the body is portrayed from its most characteristic viewpoint. Heads are shown in profile, to capture most clearly the nose, forehead, and chin, while eyes are rendered frontally, from their most recognizable and expressive viewpoint. Hips, legs, and feet are drawn in profile, and the figure is usually striding, to reveal both legs. The torso, however, is fully frontal. This artistic convention for representing the human figure as a conceptualized composite of multiple viewpoints was to be followed for millennia in Egypt when depicting royalty and other dignitaries. Persons of lesser social rank engaged in active tasks tend to be represented in ways that seem to us more lifelike. Funerary architecture. Ancient Egyptians believed that an essential part of every human personality is its life force, or soul, called the Ka, which lived on after the death of the body, forever engaged in the activities it had enjoyed in its former existence. But the Ka needed a body to live in, either the mummified body of the deceased or, as a substitute, a sculpted likeness in the form of a statue. The Egyptians developed elaborate funerary practices to ensure that their deceased moved safely and effectively into the afterlife. It was especially important to provide a comfortable home for the Ka of a departed king, so that even in the afterlife he would continue to ensure the well-being of Egypt. Egyptians preserved the bodies of the royal dead with care and placed them in burial chambers filled with sculpted body substitutes and all the supplies and furnishings the ka might require throughout eternity. Mastaba and necropolis in early dynastic Egypt, the most common tomb structure used by the upper level of society, the king's family and relatives, was the mastaba, a flat-topped, one-story building with slanted walls erected above an underground burial chamber. Mastabas were at first constructed of mud brick, but toward the end of the Third Dynasty, many incorporated cut stone, at least as an exterior facing. In its simplest form, the mastaba contained a serdab, a small, sealed room housing the ka statue of the deceased, and a chapel designed to receive mourning relatives and offerings. A vertical shaft dropped from the top of the mastaba down to the actual burial chamber, where the remains of the deceased reposed in a coffin, at times placed within a larger stone sarcophagus, surrounded by appropriate grave goods. This chamber was sealed off after interment. Mastabas might have numerous underground burial chambers to accommodate whole families, and mastaba burial remained the standard for Egyptian elites for centuries. Mastabas tended to be grouped together in a necropolis, literally, a city of the dead, at the edge of the desert on the west bank of the Nile, for the land of the dead was believed to be in the direction of the setting sun. Two of the most extensive of these early necropolises are at Saqqara and Giza, just outside modern Cairo. Djoser complex at Saqqara. For his tomb complex at Saqqara, the Third Dynasty King Djoser commissioned the earliest known monumental architecture in Egypt, Fig. The designer of the complex was Imhotep, who served as Djoser's prime minister. Imhotep is the first architect in history to be identified. His name is inscribed together with Djoser's on the base of a statue of the king found near the Step Pyramid. And purpose. A 92-foot shaft descended from the original mastaba enclosed within the pyramid. A descending corridor at the base of the Step Pyramid provided an entrance from outside to a granite-lined burial vault. The adjacent funerary temple, where priests performed rituals before placing the king's mummified body in its tomb, was used for continuing worship of the dead king. In the form of his ka statue, Djoser intended to observe these devotions through two peepholes in the wall between the serdab and the funerary chapel. To the east of the pyramid, buildings filled with debris represent actual structures in which the spirit of the dead king could continue to observe the said rituals that had ensured his long reign. The Old Kingdom, circa 2575-2150 BCE. The Old Kingdom was a time of social and political stability, despite increasingly common military excursions to defend the borders. The growing wealth of ruling families of the period is reflected in the enormous and elaborate tomb complexes they commissioned for themselves. Kings were not the only patrons of the arts, however. Upper-level government officials also could afford tombs decorated with elaborate carvings. The Great Pyramids at Giza. The architectural form most closely identified with Egypt is the true pyramid with a square base and four sloping triangular faces, first erected in the Fourth Dynasty. The angled sides may have been meant to represent the slanting rays of the sun, for inscriptions on the walls of pyramid tombs built in the 5th and 6th dynasties tell of deceased kings climbing up the rays to join the sun. Although not the first pyramids, the most famous are the three Great Pyramid tombs at Giza, Figs. 4. These were built by three successive 4th dynasty kings, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. The oldest and largest pyramid at Giza is that of Khufu, which covers 13 acres at its base. It was originally finished with a thick veneer of polished limestone that lifted its apex to almost 481 feet, some 30 feet above the present summit. The Pyramid of Khafre is slightly smaller than Khufu's, and Menkaure's is considerably smaller. The site was carefully planned to follow the sun's east-west path. Next to each of the pyramids was a funerary temple connected by a causeway, an elevated and enclosed pathway or corridor, to a valley temple on the bank of the Nile, CFIG. When a king died, his body was embalmed and ferried west across the Nile from the royal palace to his valley temple, where it was received with elaborate ceremonies. It was then carried up the causeway to his funerary temple and placed in its chapel, where family members presented offerings of food and drink, and priests performed rites in which the deceased spirit consumed a meal. These rites were to be performed at the chapel in perpetuity. Finally, the body was entombed in a vault deep within the pyramid, at the end of a long, narrow, and steeply rising passageway. This tomb chamber was sealed off after the burial with a 50-ton stone block. To further protect the king from intruders, 3 false passageways obscured the location of the tomb. Constructing the pyramids. Building a pyramid was a formidable undertaking. A large workers' burial ground discovered at Giza attests to the huge labor force that had to be assembled, housed, and fed. Most of the cut stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, used in building the Giza complex were quarried either on the site or nearby. Teams of workers transported them by sheer muscle power, employing small logs as rollers or pouring water on mud to create a slippery surface over which they could drag the blocks on sleds. Scholars and engineers have various theories about how the pyramids were raised. Some ideas have been tested in computerized projections, and a few models on a small but representative scale have been constructed. The most efficient means of getting the stones into position might have been to build a temporary, gently sloping ramp around the body of the pyramid as it grew higher. The ramp could then be dismantled as the stones were smoothed out or slabs of veneer were laid. The designers who oversaw the building of such massive structures were capable of the most sophisticated mathematical calculations. They oriented the pyramids to the points of the compass and may have incorporated other symbolic astronomical calculations as well. There was no room for trial and error. The huge foundation layer had to be absolutely level, and the angle of each of the slanting sides had to remain constant so that the stones would meet precisely in the center at the top. Kafr complex. Kafr's funerary complex is the best preserved. Its pyramid is the only one of the 3 to have maintained some of its veneer facing at the top. But the complex is most famous for the Great Sphinx that sits just behind Kafr's Valley Temple. This colossal portrait of the king, 65 feet tall, combines his head with the long body of a crouching lion, seemingly merging notions of human intelligence with animal strength. Fig. In the adjacent Valley Temple, massive blocks of red granite form walls and piers supporting a flat roof. Fig. A clear story lets in light that reflects off the polished Egyptian alabaster floor. Within the temple were a series of over life-size statues, portraying Kafr as an enthroned king. Fig. The falcon god Horus perches on the back of the throne, protectively enfolding the king's head with his wings. Lions, symbols of regal authority, form the throne's legs, and the intertwined lotus and papyrus plants beneath the seat symbolize the king's power over Upper and Lower Egypt. Kafr wears the traditional royal costume, a short, pleated kilt, a linen headdress, and a false beard symbolic of royalty. He exudes a strong sense of dignity, calm, and above all permanence. In his right hand, he holds a cylinder, probably a rolled piece of cloth. His arms are pressed tightly within the contours of his body, which is firmly anchored in the confines of the stone block from which it was carved. The statue was created from an unusual stone, a type of gneiss, imported from Nubia, that produces a rare optical effect. When illuminated by sunlight entering through the temple's clerestory, it glows a deep blue, the celestial color of Horus, filling the space with a blue radiance. Sculpture. As the surviving statues of Kafr's Valley Temple demonstrate, Egyptian sculptors were adept at creating lifelike three-dimensional figures that also express a feeling of strength and permanence consistent with the unusually hard stones from which they were carved. Menkaure and Queen. Dignity, calm, and permanence also characterize a sleek double portrait of Kafr's heir King Menkaure and a queen, probably Khmerennebti II, discovered in Menkaure's Valley Temple. Fig. The couple's separate figures, close in size, are joined by the stone from which they emerge, forming a single unit. They are further united by the queen's symbolic gesture of embrace. Her right hand comes from behind to clasp his torso, and her left hand rests gently, if stiffly, over his upper arm. The king, depicted in accordance with Egyptian ideals as an athletic, youthful figure, nude to the waist and wearing the royal kilt and headcloth, stands in a conventional, balanced pose, striding with the left foot forward, his arms straight at his sides, and his fists clenched over cylindrical objects. His equally youthful queen, taking a smaller step forward, echoes his striding pose. Her sheer, close-fitting garment reveals the soft curves of her gently swelling body, a foil for the tight muscularity of the king. The time-consuming task of polishing this double statue was never completed, suggesting that the work may have been undertaken only a few years before Menkaur's death in about 2472 BCE. Traces of red paint remain on the king's face, ears, and neck, as do traces of black on the queen's hair. Seated Scribe Old Kingdom sculptors also produced statues of less prominent people, rendered in a more relaxed, lifelike fashion. A more lively and less formal mode is employed in the statue of a seated scribe from early in the 5th dynasty, Fig. 10, with round head, alert expression, and cap of close-cropped hair, that was discovered near the tomb of a government official named Kai. It could be a portrait of Kai himself. The irregular contours of his engaging face project a sense of individual likeness and human presence. The scribe's sedentary vocation has made his sagging body slightly flabby, his condition advertising a life free from hard physical labor. As an ancient Egyptian inscription advises, become a scribe so that your limbs remain smooth and your hands soft and you can wear white and walk like a man of standing whom courtiers will greet. This scribe sits holding a papyrus scroll partially unrolled on his lap, his right hand clasping a now-lost reed brush used in writing. The alert expression on his face reveals more than a lively intelligence. Because the pupils are slightly off-center in the irises, the eyes give the illusion of being in motion, as if they were seeking contact, and the reflective quality of the polished crystal inlay reproduces with eerie fidelity the contrast between the moist surface of eyes and the surrounding soft flesh in a living human face. Statuettes of servants even more lifelike than the scribe were smaller figures of servants at work that were made for inclusion in Old Kingdom tombs so that the deceased could be provided for in the next world. Poses are neither formal nor reflective, but rooted directly in the labor these figures were expected to perform throughout eternity. A painted limestone statuette from the 5th dynasty. Fig. 11 captures a butcher, raised up on the balls of his feet to bend down and lean forward, poised, knife in hand, over the throat of an ox that he has just slaughtered. Having accomplished his work, he looks up to acknowledge us, an action that only enhances his sense of lifelike presence. The emphasis on involved poses and engagement with the viewer may have been an attempt to underscore the ability of such figures to perform their assigned tasks, or perhaps it was meant to indicate their lower social status by showing them involved in physical labor. Both may be signified here. The contrast between the detached stylization of upper-class figures and the engaging lifelikeness of laborers can be seen in Old Kingdom pictorial relief works as well. Pictorial relief in tombs to provide the Ka with the most pleasant possible living quarters for eternity. Wealthy families often had the interior walls and ceilings of their tombs decorated with paintings and reliefs. This decoration carried religious meaning, but it could also evoke the deceased's everyday life or depict ceremonial events that proclaimed the deceased's importance. Tombs therefore provide a wealth of information about ancient Egyptian culture. The tomb of Ti on the walls of the large mastaba of a wealthy 5th dynasty government official named Ti, a painted relief shows him watching a hippopotamus hunt, an official duty of royal courtiers. Fig. 12. It was believed that Seth, the god of chaos, disguised himself as a hippo. Hippos were also destructive since they wandered into fields, damaging crops. Tomb depictions of such hunts therefore proclaimed the valor of the deceased and the triumph of good over evil, or at least order over destructiveness. The artists who created this picture in painted limestone relief used a number of established Egyptian representational conventions. The river is conceived as if seen from above, rendered as a band of parallel wavy lines below the boats. The creatures in this river, however, fish, a crocodile, and hippopotamuses, are shown in profile for easy identification. The shallow boats carrying T and his men by skimming along the surface of the water are shown straight on in relation to the viewer's vantage point, and the papyrus stalks that choke the marshy edges of the river are disciplined into a regular pattern of projecting, linear, parallel, vertical forms that highlight the contrastingly crisp and smooth contour of Ti's stylized body. At the top of the papyrus grove, however, this patterning relaxes while enthusiastic animals of prey, perhaps foxes, stalk birds among the leaves and flowers. The hierarchically scaled and sleekly stylized figure of T, rendered in the conventional composite pose, looms over all. In a separate boat. Ahead of him, the actual hunters, being of lesser rank and engaged in more strenuous activities, are rendered in a more lifelike and lively fashion than their master. They are captured at the charged moment of closing in on the hunted prey, spears positioned at the ready, legs extended for the critical lunge forward. The Middle Kingdom, circa 1975, circa 1640 BCE. The collapse of the Old Kingdom, with its long succession of powerful kings, was followed by roughly 150 years of political turmoil, fragmentation, and warfare, traditionally referred to as the First Intermediate Period. About 2010 BCE, a series of kings named Mentuhotep gained power in Thebes, and the country was reunited under Nebuchadnezzar, who reasserted royal power and founded the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom was another high point in Egyptian history. Arts and writing flourished in the 12th dynasty, while reflecting a burgeoning awareness of the political upheaval from which the country had just emerged. Using a strengthened military, Middle Kingdom rulers expanded and patrolled the borders, especially in Lower Nubia, south of present-day Aswan, see map. Page 50. By the 13th dynasty. However, central control by the government was weakened by a series of short-lived kings and an influx of foreigners, especially in the Delta. Portraits of Senusret III. Some royal portraits from the Middle Kingdom appear to express an unexpected awareness of the hardship and fragility of human existence. Statues of Senusret III, a king of the 12th dynasty, who ruled from circa 1836 to 1818 BCE, reflects this new sensibility. Old Kingdom rulers such as Khafre, cfig, gaze into eternity confident and serene, toned and unflinching, whereas the portrait of Senusret III seems to capture a monarch preoccupied and emotionally drained, fig. 13. Croesus line his sagging cheeks, his eyes are sunken, his eyelids droop, his forehead is flexed, and his jaw is sternly set, a bold image of a resolute ruler, tested but unbowed. Senusret was a dynamic king and successful general who led 4 military expeditions into Nubia, overhauled the Egyptian central administration, and was effective in regaining control over the country's increasingly independent nobles. To modern viewers, his portrait raises questions of interpretation. Are we looking at the face of a man wise in the ways of the world but lonely, saddened, and burdened by the weight of his responsibilities? Or are we looking at a reassuring statement that in spite of troubled times, that have clearly left their mark on the face of the ruler himself, royal rule endures in Egypt? Given what we know about Egyptian history at this time, it is difficult to be sure. Rock-cut tombs during the 11th and 12th dynasties, members of the nobility and high-level officials commissioned tombs hollowed out of the face of a cliff. A typical rock-cut tomb included an entrance portico, a main hall, and a shrine with a burial chamber under the offering chapel. The chambers of these tombs, as well as their ornamental columns, lintels, false doors, and niches, were all carved into the solid rock. An impressive necropolis was created in the cliffs at Beni Hassan on the east bank of the Nile, Fig. 14. Painted scenes cover the interior walls of many tombs. Among the best preserved are those in the 12th dynasty tomb of local noble Khnumhotep, some of which portray vivid vignettes of farm work on his estates. In one painting, two men harvest figs, rushing to compete with three baboons who relish the ripe fruit from their perches within the trees. Fig. 15. One man reaches for a fig to add to the ordered stack in his basket, while his companion carefully arranges the harvest in a larger box for transport. Like the energetic hunters on the much earlier painted relief in the tomb of T.C.Fig. 12. The upper torsos of these farm workers take a more lifelike profile posture, deviating from the strict frontality of the royal composite pose. Funerary stelae. Only the wealthiest and noblest of ancient Egyptians could afford elaborately decorated mastabas or rock-cut tombs. Prosperous people, however, could still commission funerary stelae depicting themselves, their family, and offerings of food. These personal monuments, meant to preserve the memory of the deceased and inspire the living to make offerings to them, contain compelling works of ancient Egyptian pictorial art. An unfinished stele made for the tomb of the sculptor Userwer presents 3 levels of decoration, one large upper block with 5 bands of hieroglyphs, beneath which are 2 registers with figures, each identified by inscription. The text is addressed to the living, imploring them to make offerings to Userwer. O living ones who are on the earth who pass by this tomb, as your deities love and favor you, may you say, 1,000 of bread and beer, 1,000 of cattle and birds, 1,000 of alabaster and clothes, 1,000 of offerings and provisions that go forth before Osiris. At left, on the register immediately below this inscription, Userwer sits before a table piled with offerings of food. Behind him is his wife Satdepet Netjer, and facing him on the other side of the offering table is Satamini, a standing woman also identified as his wife. Userwer could have had more than one wife, but one of these women might also be the sculptor's deceased first wife. At the other side of the stele on the same register but facing in the opposite direction sits another couple before another table heaped with food. They are identified as Userwer's parents, and the figure on the other side of their offering table is his son, Sneferuzer. In the lowest register are representations of other family members and his grandparents. One of the most striking features of the lowest register of this stele is its unfinished state. The 2 leftmost figures were left uncarved, but the stone surface still maintains the preparatory ink drawing meant to guide the sculptor, preserving striking evidence of a system of canonical figure proportions that was established in the Middle Kingdom. The unfinished state of this stele has led to the suggestion that Userwer might have been in the process of carving it for himself when his sudden death left it incomplete. A more modest stele for a man named Amenemhat was brought to completion as a vibrantly painted relief. Fig. 17. Underneath an inscription inviting food offerings for the deceased Amenemhat is a portrait of his family. Amenemhat sits on a lion-legged bench between his wife Thi and their son Antef, embraced by both. Next to the trio is an offering table, heaped with meat, topped with onions, and sheltering 2 loaves of bread standing under the table on the floor. On the far right is Amenemhat and Thi's daughter, Hapi, completing this touching tableau of family unity, presumably projected into their life after death. The painter of this relief follows an established Egyptian convention of differentiating gender by skin tonality, dark red-brown for men and lighter yellow-ochre for women. Town planning. Although Egyptians used durable materials in the construction of tombs, they built their own dwellings with simple mud bricks, which have either disintegrated over time or been carried away for fertilizer by farmers. Only the foundations of these dwellings now remain. Archaeologists have unearthed the remains of Kahan, a town built by Senusret II for the many officials, priests, and workers who built and maintained his pyramid complex. Parallel streets were laid out on a grid, forming rectangular blocks divided into lots for homes and other buildings. The houses of priests, court officials, and their families were large and comfortable, with private living quarters and public rooms grouped around central courtyards. The largest had as many as 70 rooms spread out over half an acre. Workers and their families made do with small, 5-room row houses built back-to-back along narrow streets. a new kingdom workers' village, discovered at Deir el-Medina on the west bank of the Nile near the Valley of the Kings, has provided us with detailed information about the lives of the people who created the royal tombs. Workers lived together here under the rule of the king's chief minister. During a 10-day week, they worked for 8 days and had 2 days off, and also participated in many religious festivals. They lived a good life with their families, were given clothing, sandals, grain, and firewood by the king, and had permission to raise livestock and birds as well as tend a garden. The residents had a council, and the many written records that survive suggest a literate and litigious society that required many scribes, because the men were away for most of the week working. On the tombs, women had a prominent role in the town. The New Kingdom, circa 1539-1075 BCE during the Second Intermediate period, another turbulent interruption in the succession of dynasties ruling a unified Egypt, an eastern Mediterranean people called the Hyksos invaded Egypt's northernmost regions. Finally, the kings of the 18th dynasty regained control of the entire Nile region, extending from Nubia in the south to the Mediterranean Sea in the north, and restored political and economic strength. Roughly a century later, one of the same dynasty's most dynamic kings, Thutmose III, r. 1479-1425 BCE, extended Egypt's influence along the eastern Mediterranean coast as far as the region of present-day Syria. His accomplishment was the result of 15 or more military campaigns and his own skill at diplomacy. The heartland of ancient Egypt was now surrounded by a buffer of empire. Thutmose III was the first ruler to refer to himself as pharaoh, a term that literally meant great house. Egyptians used it in the same way that Americans say the White House to mean the current U.S. president and his staff. The successors of Thutmose III continued to call themselves pharaohs, and the term ultimately found its way into the Hebrew Bible and modern usage as the title for the kings of Egypt. The great temple complexes at the height of the New Kingdom, rulers undertook extensive building programs along the entire length of the Nile. Their palaces, forts, and administrative centers disappeared long ago, but remnants of temples and tombs of this great age have endured. Thebes was Egypt's religious center throughout most of the New Kingdom, and worship of the Theban triad of deities, Amun, his wife Mut, and their son Khons, had spread throughout the country. Temples to these and other gods were a major focus of royal patronage, as were tombs and temples erected to glorify the kings themselves. The New Kingdom temple planned as the home of the god, an Egyptian temple originally took the form of a house, a simple, rectangular, flat-roofed building preceded by a courtyard and gateway. The builders of the New Kingdom enlarged and multiplied these elements. The gateway became a massive pylon with tapering walls, the semi-public courtyard was surrounded by columns, the temple itself included an outer hypostyle hall and an inner offering hall and sanctuary. The design was symmetrical and axial, that is, all its separate elements are symmetrically arranged along a dominant center line, creating a processional path from the outside straight into the sanctuary. The rooms became smaller, darker, and more exclusive as they neared the sanctuary, where the cult image of the god was housed. Only the pharaoh and the priests entered these inner rooms. 2 temple districts consecrated primarily to the worship of Amun, Mut, and Khons arose within the area of Thebes, a huge complex at Karnak to the north and, joined to it by an avenue of sphinxes, a more compact temple at Luxor to the south. Karnak was a long-standing sacred site, where temples were built and rebuilt for over 1,500 years. During the nearly 500 years of the New Kingdom, successive kings renovated and expanded the complex of the Great Temple of Amun until it covered about 60 acres, an area as large as a dozen football fields. Fig. 18. Access to the heart of the temple, a sanctuary containing the statue of Amun, was from the west through a principal courtyard, a hypostyle hall, and a number of smaller halls and courts. Pylons set off each of these separate elements. Between the reigns of Thutmose I and Ramses II, this area of the complex underwent a great deal of construction and renewal. The greater part of the pylons leading to the sanctuary and the halls and courts behind them were renovated or newly built and embellished with colorful pictorial wall reliefs. A sacred lake was also added to the south of the complex, where the king and priests might undergo ritual purification before entering the temple. Thutmose III erected a court and festival temple to his own glory behind the Sanctuary of Amman. His great-grandson Amenhotep III placed a large stone statue of the god Khepri, the scarab symbolic of the rising sun, rebirth, and everlasting life, next to the sacred lake. In the Sanctuary of Amman, priests washed the god's statue every morning and clothed it in a new garment. Because the god was thought to derive nourishment from the spirit of food, his statue was provided with tempting meals twice a day, which the priests then removed and ate themselves. Ordinary people entered the temple precinct only as far as the forecourts of the hypostyle halls, where they found themselves surrounded by inscriptions and images of kings and the god on columns and walls. During religious festivals, they lined the waterways, along which statues of the gods were carried in ceremonial boats, and were permitted to submit petitions to the priests. For requests they wished the gods to grant. The Great Hall at Karnak. One of the most prominent features of the complex at Karnak is the enormous hypostyle hall set between two pylons at the end of the main forecourt. Erected in the reigns of the 19th dynasty rulers Seti I and his son Ramses II, and called the Temple of the Spirit of Seti, beloved of Ptah in the House of Amun, it may have been used for royal coronation ceremonies. Ramses II referred to it as the place where the common people extol the name of His Majesty. The hall was 340 feet wide and 170 feet long. Its 134 closely spaced columns supported a roof of flat stones, the center section of which rose some 30 feet higher than the broadsides. Figs 19, 20. The columns supporting this higher part of the roof are 69 feet tall and 12 feet in diameter, with massive papyrus capitals. On each side, smaller columns with bud capitals seem to march off forever into the darkness. In each of the side walls of the higher center section, a long row of window openings created a clerestory. These openings were filled with stone grillwork, so they cannot have provided much light, but they did permit a cooling flow of air through the hall. Despite the dimness of the interior, artists covered nearly every inch of the columns, walls, and crossbeams with painted pictorial reliefs and inscriptions. Hatshepsut across the Nile from Karnak and Luxor lay Deir el-Bahari and the valleys of the kings and queens. These valleys on the west bank of the Nile held the royal necropolis, including the tomb of the pharaoh Hatshepsut. The dynamic Hatshepsut is a notable figure in a period otherwise dominated by male warrior kings. Besides Hatshepsut, very few women ruled Egypt. They included the little-known Sobenfru and Tosrat, and much later, the well-known Cleopatra VII. The daughter of Thutmose I, Hatshepsut married her half-brother, who then reigned for 14 years as Thutmose II. When he died in c. 1473, she became regent for his underage son, Thutmose III, born to one of his concubines. Within a few years, Hatshepsut had herself declared king by the priests of Amun, a maneuver that made her co-ruler with Thutmose III for 20 years. There was no artistic formula for a female pharaoh in Egyptian art, yet Hatshepsut had to be portrayed in her new role. What happened reveals something fundamentally important about the art of ancient Egypt. She was represented as a male king, Fig. 21, wearing a kilt and linen headdress, occasionally even a king's false beard. The formula for portraying kings was not adapted to suit one individual, she was adapted to conform to convention. There could hardly be a more powerful manifestation of the premium on tradition in Egyptian royal art. At the height of the New Kingdom, rulers undertook extensive personal building programs, and Hatshepsut is responsible for one of the most spectacular, her funerary temple located at Deir el-Bahari, about a mile away from her actual tomb in the Valley of the Kings, Fig. 22. This imposing complex was designed for funeral rites and commemorative ceremonies and is much larger and more prominent than the tomb itself, reversing the scale relationship we saw in the Old Kingdom pyramid complexes. magnificently sited and sensitively reflecting the natural three-part layering in the rise of the landscape, from flat desert, through a sloping hillside, to the crescendo of sheer stone cliffs. Hatshepsut's temple was constructed on an axial plan. Fig. 23. A causeway lined with sphinxes once ran from a valley temple on the Nile to the huge open space of the first court, where rare myrrh trees were planted in the temple's garden terraces. From there, visitors ascended a long, straight ramp to a second court where shrines to Anubis and Hathor occupy the ends of the columned porticos. On the temple's uppermost court, colossal royal statues fronted another colonnade, and behind this lay a large hypostyle hall with chapels dedicated to Hatshepsut, her father, and the gods Amun and Are-Horikti, a powerful form of the sun god Are combined with Horus. Centered in the hall's back wall was the entrance to the innermost sanctuary, a small chamber cut deep into the cliff. The tomb of Ramos, the traditional art of pictorial relief, employing a representational system that had dominated Egyptian figural art since the time of Narmer, reached a high degree of aesthetic refinement and technical sophistication during the reign of Amenhotep III, especially in the reliefs carved for the unfinished tomb of Ramos near Thebes. Fig. 24. As mayor of Thebes and vizier to both Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV, Ramos was second only to the pharaoh in power and prestige. Soon after his ascent to political prominence, he began construction of an elaborate Theban tomb comprised of 4 rooms, including an imposing hypostyle hall 82 feet wide. Walls were covered with paintings or with shallow pictorial relief carvings, celebrating the accomplishments, affiliations, and lineage of Ramos and his wife Merimta, or visualizing the funeral rites that would take place after their death. But the tomb was not used by Ramos. Work on it ceased in the 4th year of Amenhotep IV's reign, when, renamed Akhenaten, he relocated the court from Thebes to the new city of Akhenaten. Presumably Ramos moved with the court to the new capital, but neither his name nor a new tomb has been discovered there. The tomb was abandoned in various stages of completion. The reliefs were never painted, and some walls preserve only the preliminary sketches that would have guided sculptors. But the works that were executed are among the most sophisticated relief carvings in the history of art. On one wall, Ramos and his wife Merimta appear, hosting a banquet for their family. All are portrayed at the same moment of youthful perfection, even though they represent 2 successive generations. Sophisticated carvers lavished their considerable technical virtuosity on the portrayal of these untroubled and majestic couples, creating clear textural differentiation of skin, hair, clothes, and jewelry. The easy elegance of linear fluidity is not easy to obtain in this medium, and the convincing sense of three-dimensionality in forms and their placement is managed within an extraordinarily shallow depth of relief. In the detail of Ramos' brother May and sister-in-law Werner in Fig. 24, the traditional ancient Egyptian marital embrace. See Figs. 9. 17, takes on a new tenderness, recalling, especially within the eternal stillness of a tomb, the words of a New Kingdom love poem. While unhurried days come and go, let us turn to each other in quiet affection. Walk in peace to the edge of old age. And I shall be with you each unhurried day, a woman given her one wish, to see for a lifetime the face of her Lord. Love Songs of the New Kingdom, trans. Foster, page 18, the conceptual conventions of Egyptian royal art are rendered in these carvings with such warmth and refinement that they become almost believable. Our rational awareness of their artificiality is momentarily eclipsed by their sheer beauty. But within this refined world of stable convention, something very jarring took place during the reign of Amenhotep III's successor, Amenhotep IV. Akhenaten and the art of the Amarna period. Amenhotep IV was surely the most unusual ruler in the history of ancient Egypt. During his 17-year reign, he radically transformed the political, spiritual, and cultural life of the country. He founded a new religion honoring a single supreme god, the life-giving sun deity Aten, and changed his own name in about 1348 BCE to Akhenaten. Abandoning Thebes, the capital of Egypt since the beginning of his dynasty and a city firmly in the grip of the priests of Amman, Akhenaten built a new capital much farther north, calling it Akhenaten. Using the modern name for this site, Tel el Amarna, historians refer to Akhenaten's reign as the Amarna period. The new Amarna-style Akhenaten's reign not only saw the creation of a new capital and the rise of a new religious focus, it also led to radical changes in royal artistic conventions. In portraits of the king, artists subjected his representation to startling stylizations, even physical distortions. This new royal figure style can be seen in a colossal statue of Akhenaten, about 16 feet tall, created for a new temple to the Aten that he built near the temple complex of Karnak, openly challenging the state gods. Fig. 25. This portrait was placed in one of the porticos of a huge courtyard, oriented to the movement of the sun. The sculpture's strange, softly swelling forms suggest androgyny to modern viewers. The sagging stomach and inflated thighs contrast with spindly arms, protruding clavicles, and an attenuated neck, on which sits a strikingly stylized head. Facial features are exaggerated, often distorted. Slit-like eyes turn slightly downward, and the bulbous, sensuous lips are flanked by dimples that evoke the expression of ephemeral human emotion. Such stark deviations from convention are disquieting, especially since Akhenaten holds the flail and shepherd's crook, traditional symbols of the pharaoh's superhuman sovereignty. The new Amarna style characterizes not only official royal portraits, but also pictorial relief sculpture portraying the family life of Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. In one panel, the king and queen sit on cushioned stools playing with their new daughters. Fig. 26, whose elongated shaved heads conform to the newly minted figure type. The royal couple receive the blessings of the Aten, whose rays end in hands that penetrate the open pavilion to offer thanks before their nostrils, giving them the breath of life. The king holds one child and lovingly pats her head, while she pulls herself forward to kiss him. The youngest of the three perches on Nefertiti's shoulder, trying to attract her mother's attention by stroking her cheek, while the oldest sits on the queen's lap, tugging at her mother's hand and pointing to her father. What a striking contrast with the relief from Ramses' tomb. Rather than composed serenity, this artist has conveyed the fidgety behavior of children and the loving involvement of their parents in a manner not even hinted at in earlier royal portraiture. The portrait of Akhenaten's goals were actively supported not only by Nefertiti but also by his mother, Queen Fig. 27. She had been the chief wife of the king's father, Amenhotep III, and had played a significant role in affairs of state during his reign. Queen Tiye's personality seems to emerge from a miniature portrait head that reveals the exquisite bone structure of her dark-skinned face, with its arched brows, up-tilted eyes, and full lips. Originally, this portrait included a funerary silver headdress covered with gold cobras and gold jewelry. But after her son came to power and established his new religion, the portrait was altered. A brown cap covered with blue glass beads was placed over the original headdress. The head of Nefertiti, the famous head of Nefertiti, Fig. 28, was discovered in 1912, along with drawings and other items related to commissions for the royal family, in the Akhenaten studio of the sculptor Thutmose. It may have served as a model for full-length sculptures or paintings of the queen. In 2007, analysis of this famous work using a CT scan revealed the existence of a delicately carved limestone sculpture underneath the mottled stucco that forms its outer surface. The faces of the queen in the two likenesses differ slightly. The sculptor seems to have smoothed out in stucco some of the facial irregularities in the underlying limestone carving, including a bump in Nefertiti's nose and creases around her mouth, and increased the prominence of her cheekbones, probably to bring the queen's face into conformity with contemporary notions of beauty. Much in the way we would retouch a photographic image. The proportions of Nefertiti's refined, regular features, long neck, and heavy-lidded eyes appear almost too ideal to be human, but are eerily consistent with standards of beauty in our own culture. Part of the appeal of this portrait bust, aside from its stunning beauty, may be the artist's dramatic use of color. The hues of the blue headdress and its striped band are repeated in the rich red, blue, green, and gold of the jeweled necklace. The queen's brows, eyelids, cheeks, and lips are heightened with color, as they no doubt were heightened with cosmetics in real life. Glassmaking could only be practiced by artists working for the king, and Akhenaten's new capital had its own glassmaking workshops. A bottle produced there and meant to hold scented oil was fashioned in the shape of a fish that has been identified as a bolti, a species that carries its eggs in its mouth and spits out its offspring when they hatch, cfig. 33. The bolti was a common symbol for birth and regeneration, complementing the self-generation that Akhenaten attributed to the sun disk Aten. The return to tradition, Tutankhamun and Ramses II. Akhenaten's new religion and revolutionary reconception of pharaonic art outlived him by only a few years. The priesthood of Amman quickly regained its former power, and his young son Tutankhaten returned to traditional religious beliefs, changing his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amman, and moving the court back to Thebes. He died at age 19 and was buried in the Valley of the Kings. Although some had doubted the royal lineage of the young Tutankhaten, recent DNA testing of a series of royal mummies from this period confirmed that he was the son of Akhenaten and one of his sisters. And his death at such a young age seems not to have been the result of royal intrigue and assassination, but poor health and serious injury. The DNA analysis documented his struggles with malaria, and CT scans revealed a badly broken and seriously infected leg, as well as a series of birth defects that have been ascribed to royal inbreeding. Tutankhamun. The sealed inner chamber of Tutankhamun's tomb was never plundered, and when it was found in 1922 its incredible riches were just as they had been left since his interment. His mummified body, crowned with a spectacular mask preserving his royal likeness, cfig, lay inside 3 nested coffins that identified him with Osiris, the god of the dead. The innermost coffin, in the shape of a mummy, is the richest of the 3, Fig. 29, made of over 240 pounds of gold. Its surface is decorated with colored glass and semi-precious gemstones, as well as finely incised linear designs and hieroglyphic inscriptions. The king holds a crook and a flail, symbols that were associated with Osiris and had become a traditional part of the royal regalia. Anem's headcloth with projecting cobra and vulture covers his head, and a blue braided beard is attached to his chin. Nekbet and Wadjet, vulture and cobra goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt, spread their wings across his body. The king's features as reproduced on the coffin and masks are those of a very young man, and the unusually full lips, thin-bridged nose, and pierced earlobe suggest the continuing vitality of some Amarna stylizations. Ramses II, an Abu symbol by Egyptian standards. Tutankhamun was a rather minor king. Ramses II, on the other hand, was both powerful and long-lived. Under Ramses II, Egypt was a mighty empire. He was a bold leader and an effective political strategist. Although he did not win every battle, he was an effective master of royal propaganda, able to turn military defeats into glorious victories. He also triumphed diplomatically by securing a peace agreement with the Hittites, a rival power centered in Anatolia that had tried to expand to the west and south at Egypt's expense. Ramses twice reaffirmed that agreement by marrying Hittite princesses. In the course of a long and prosperous reign, Ramses II initiated building projects on a scale rivaling the Old Kingdom pyramids at Giza. Today, the most awe-inspiring of his many architectural monuments are found at Karnak and Luxor, and at Abu Simbel in Egypt's southernmost region. At Abu Simbel, Ramses ordered 2 large temples to be carved into natural rock, one for himself and the other for his principal wife, Nefertari. The temples at Abu Simbel were not funerary monuments. Ramses and Nefertari's tombs are in the valleys of the kings and queens. The walls of Nefertari's tomb are covered with exquisite paintings. In one mural, Nefertari offers jars of perfumed ointment to the goddess Isis, Fig. 34. The queen wears the vulture skin headdress and jeweled collar indicating her royal position, and a long, semi-transparent white linen gown. Isis, seated on her throne behind a table heaped with offerings, holds a long scepter in her left hand, the ankh in her right. She wears a headdress surmounted by the horns of Hathor framing a sun disk, clear indications of her divinity. The artists responsible for decorating the tomb diverged very subtly but distinctively from earlier stylistic conventions. The outline drawing and use of pure colors within the lines reflect traditional practices, but quite new is the slight modeling of the body forms by small changes of hue to enhance the appearance of three-dimensionality. The skin color of these women is much darker than that conventionally used for females in earlier periods, and lightly brushed in shading emphasizes their eyes and lips. The Books of the Dead. By the time of the New Kingdom, the Egyptians had come to believe that only a person free from wrongdoing could enjoy an afterlife. The dead were thought to undergo a last judgment consisting of two tests presided over by Osiris, the god of the underworld, and supervised by the jackal-headed god of embalming and cemeteries, Anubis. After the deceased were questioned about their behavior in life, their hearts, which the Egyptians believed to be the seat of the soul, were weighed on a scale against an ostrich feather, the symbol of Ma'at, goddess of truth, order, and justice. Family members commissioned papyrus scrolls containing magical texts or spells, which the embalmers sometimes placed among the wrappings of the mummified bodies. Early collectors of Egyptian artifacts referred to such scrolls, often beautifully illustrated, as Books of the Dead. A scene in one that was created for a man named Hunfer shows 3 successive stages in his induction into the afterlife, Fig. 35. At the left, Anubis leads him by the hand to the spot where he will weigh his heart against the feather of truth. Ma'at herself appears atop the balancing arm of the scales wearing the feather as a headdress. To the right of the scales, Ammit, the dreaded eater of the dead, part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus, watches eagerly for a sign from the ibis-headed god Thoth, who prepares to record the result of the weighing. But the eater goes hungry. Hunfer passes the test, and Horus, on the right, presents him to the enthroned Osiris, who floats on a lake of natron. Behind the throne, the goddesses Nephthys and Isis support the god's left arm, while in front of him Horus's 4 sons, each entrusted with the care of one of the deceased's vital organs, stand atop a huge lotus blossom rising up out of the lake. In the top register, Hunfer, finally accepted into the afterlife, kneels before 14 gods of the underworld. The Third Intermediate Period, circa 1075-715 BCE. After the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt was ruled by a series of new dynasties, whose leaders continued the traditional patterns of royal patronage and pushed figural conventions in new and interesting directions. One of the most extraordinary, and certainly one of the largest, surviving examples of ancient Egyptian bronze sculpture dates from this period, Fig. 36. An inscription on the base identifies the subject as Karamama, divine consort of Amun and member of a community of virgin priestesses selected from the pharaoh's family or retinue who were dedicated to him. Karamama herself was the granddaughter of King Osorkon. These priestesses amassed great power, held property, and maintained their own court, often passing on their position to one of their nieces. The sistra that Karamama once carried in her hands would have immediately identified her as a priestess rather than a princess. The main body of this statue was cast in bronze and subsequently covered with a thin sheathing of bronze, which was then exquisitely engraved with patterns inlaid with gold, silver, and electrum. Much of the inlay has disappeared, but we can still make out the elaborately incised drawing of the bird wings that surround Karamama and accentuate the fullness of her figure, conceived to embody a new female ideal. Her slender limbs, ample hips, and more prominent breasts contrast with the uniformly slender female figures of the late New Kingdom, CFIG. 34. Late Egyptian art, c. 715, 332. BCE. The late period in Egypt saw the country and its art in the hands and service of foreigners. Nubians, Persians, Macedonians, Greeks, and Romans were all attracted to Egypt's riches and seduced by its art. In the 8th century, Nubians from the powerful kingdom of Kush, ancient Egypt's neighbor to the south, conquered Egypt, establishing capitals at Memphis and Thebes and adopting Egyptian religious practices, artistic conventions, and architectural forms. The Sphinx of the Nubian king Taharqa expresses royal power in a tradition dating back to the Old Kingdom, cfig. The two cobras on his forehead perhaps representing Taharqa's two kingdoms, Kush and Egypt, Fig. 37. The facial features, however, clearly identify him as African, and his specific identity is secured by an inscription engraved into his chest. In 332 BCE, Macedonian Greeks led by Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, and after Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his generals divided up his empire. Ptolemy, a Greek, took Egypt, declaring himself king in 305 BCE. The Ptolemaic dynasty ended with the death of Cleopatra VII, when the Romans succeeded as Egypt's rulers and made it the breadbasket of Rome. 4. Art of the ancient Aegean. This elegantly posed and sharply silhouetted girl, reaching to pluck the crocus flowers blooming on the hillside in front of her, Fig. offers us a window into life in the ancient Aegean world. The image is from a fresco of c. 1650 BCE found in a house in Akrotiri, a town on the Aegean island of Thera that seems to have been famous for the saffron harvested from its crocuses. Saffron was valued in the Bronze Age Aegean mainly as a yellow dye in textile production, but it also had medicinal properties and was used to alleviate menstrual cramps. The latter use may be referenced in this image, since the fresco was part of the elaborate painted decoration of a room that some scholars believe housed the coming-of-age ceremonies of young women at the onset of menses. The crocus gatherer's shaved head and looped long ponytail are attributes of childhood, but the light blue color of her scalp indicates that her hair is beginning to grow out, suggesting that she is entering adolescence. The house that contained this painting disappeared suddenly more than 3,600 years ago, when the volcano that formed the island of Thera erupted, spewing pumice that filled and sealed every crevice of Akrotiri, fortunately, after the residents had fled. The rediscovery of the lost town in 1967 was among the most significant archaeological events of the second half of the 20th century, and excavation of the city is still underway. The opportunity that Thera affords archaeologists to study works of art and architecture in context has allowed for a deeper understanding of the Bronze Age cultures of the Aegean. As the image of the girl gathering crocuses illustrates, wall paintings may reflect the ritual uses of a room or building, and the meanings of artifacts are better understood by considering both where they are found and how they are grouped with one another. Before 3000 BCE until about 1100 BCE, several Bronze Age cultures flourished simultaneously across the Aegean, on a cluster of small islands called the Cyclades, on Crete and other islands in the eastern Mediterranean, and on mainland Greece, map. To learn about these cultures, archaeologists have studied shipwrecks, homes, and grave sites, as well as the ruins of architectural complexes. Archaeology, uncovering and interpreting material culture to reconstruct its original context, is our principal means of understanding the Bronze Age culture of the Aegean, since only one of its 3 written languages has been decoded. In recent years, archaeologists and art historians have collaborated with researchers in such areas of study as the history of trade and the history of climate change to provide an ever-clearer picture of ancient Aegean society. But many sites await excavation, or even discovery. The history of the Aegean Bronze Age is still being written. The Bronze Age in the Aegean using metal ores imported from Europe, Arabia, and Anatolia, Aegean peoples created exquisite objects of bronze that were prized for export. This early period when the manufacture of bronze tools and weapons became widespread is known as the Aegean Bronze Age. For the ancient Aegean peoples, the sea provided an important link not only between the mainland and the islands, but also to the world beyond. in contrast to the landlocked civilizations of the Near East, and to the Egyptians, who used river transportation. The peoples of the Aegean were seafarers, and their ports welcomed ships from other cultures around the Mediterranean. For this reason, shipwrecks offer a rich source of information about the material culture of these ancient societies. For example, the wreck of a trading vessel thought to have sunk in or soon after 1306 BCE and discovered in the vicinity of Uluburan, off the southern coast of modern Turkey, carried an extremely varied cargo: metal ingots, bronze weapons and tools, aromatic resins, fruits and spices, jewelry and beads, African ebony, ivory tusks, ostrich eggs, discs of blue glass ready to be melted down for reuse, and ceramics from the Near East, mainland Greece, and Cyprus. Among the gold objects was a scarab associated with Nefertiti, wife of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. The cargo suggests that this vessel cruised from port to port along the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean seas, loading and unloading goods as it went. It also suggests that the peoples of Egypt and the ancient Near East were important trading partners. Probably the thorniest problem in Aegean archaeology is that of dating the finds. In the case of the Uluburan wreck, the dating of a piece of freshly cut firewood on the ship to 1306 BCE, using a technique called dendrochronology that analyzes the spaces between growth rings, allowed unusual precision in pinpointing the moment this ship sunk. But archaeologists are not always able to find such easily datable materials. They usually rely on a relative dating system for the Aegean Bronze Age, based largely on pottery, but assigning specific dates to sites and objects with this system is complicated and controversial. One cataclysmic event has helped: a huge volcanic explosion on the Cycladic island of Thera, as we have seen, devastated Minoan civilization there and on Crete, only 70 miles to the south. Evidence from tree rings from Ireland and California and traces of volcanic ash and ice cores from Greenland put the date of the eruption about 1650–1625 BCE. Sometimes in this book you will find periods cited without attached dates, and in other books you may encounter different dates from those given for objects shown here. You should expect dating to change in the future as our knowledge grows and new techniques of dating emerge. The Cycladic Islands. On the Cycladic Islands, late Neolithic and early Bronze Age people developed a thriving culture. They engaged in agriculture, herding, crafts, and trade, using local stone to build fortified towns and hillside burial chambers. Because they left no written records, their artifacts are our principal source of information about them. From about 6000 BCE, Cycladic artists used a coarse, poor-quality local clay to make a variety of ceramic objects, including engaging ceramic figurines of humans and animals, as well as domestic and ceremonial wares. Some 3,000 years later, they began to produce marble sculptures. The Cyclades, especially the islands of Naxos and Paros, had ample supplies of a fine and durable white marble. Sculptors used this stone to create sleek, abstracted representations of human figures, ranging from a few inches to almost 5 feet tall. They were shaped, perhaps by women, with scrapers made of obsidian and smoothed by polishing stones of emery, both materials easily available on the Cyclades. These sculptures have been found almost exclusively in graves, and, although there are a few surviving male figures, the overwhelming majority represent nude women and conform to a consistent representational convention, Fig. They are presented in extended poses of strict symmetry, with arms folded just under gently protruding breasts, as if they were clutching their abdomens. Necks are long, heads tilted back, and faces are featureless except for a prominent, elongated nose. All body parts are pared down to essentials, and some joints and junctures are indicated with incised lines. The sculptors carefully designed these figures, laying them out with a compass in conformity to 3 evenly spaced and equally sized circles, the first delineated by the upper arch of the head and the waist, the second by the sloping shoulders and the line of the knees, and the third beginning with the curving limit of the paired feet and meeting the bottom of the upper circle at the waist. For us, these elegant, pure stylizations recall the modern work of sculptors like Brancusi, but originally their smooth marble surfaces were enlivened by painted motifs in blue, red, and more rarely green paint, emphasizing their surfaces rather than their three-dimensional shapes. Today, evidence of such painting is extremely faint, but many patterns have been recovered using controlled lighting and microscopic investigation. Unlike the forms themselves, the painted features are often asymmetrical in organization. In the example illustrated here, wide-open eyes appear on forehead, cheeks, and thigh, as well as on either side of the nose. Art historians have proposed a variety of explanations for the meaning of these painted motifs. The angled lines on some figures' bodies could bear witness to the way Cycladic peoples decorated their own bodies, whether permanently with tattoos or scarification, or temporarily with body paint, applied either during their lifetimes or to prepare their bodies for burial. The staring eyes, which seem to demand the viewer's return gaze, may have been a way of connecting these sculpted images to those who owned or used them. And eyes on locations other than faces may aim to draw viewers' attention, perhaps even healing powers, to a particular area of the body. Some have associated eyes on bellies with pregnancy. Art historian Gail Hoffman has argued that patterns of vertical red lines painted on the faces of some figures, fig, were related to Cycladic rituals of mourning their dead. Perhaps these sculptures were used in relation to a succession of key moments throughout their owners' lifetimes, such as puberty, marriage, and death, and were continually repainted with motifs associated with each ritual, before finally following their owners into their graves at death. Since there is no written evidence from Cycladic culture, and since our knowledge is hindered by the absence of any information on the archaeological contexts of many works, it is difficult to be certain, but these sculptures were clearly important to Bronze Age Cycladic peoples and seem to have taken on meaning in relationship to their use. Although some Cycladic islands retained their distinctive artistic traditions, by the Middle and later Bronze Age, the art and culture of the Cyclades as a whole was subsumed by Minoan and later, Mycenaean culture. The Minoan civilization on Crete. As early as the Neolithic period, there was large-scale migration to and permanent settlement on Crete, the largest of the Aegean islands. By the Bronze Age, Crete was economically self-sufficient, producing its own grains, olives and other fruits, cattle, and sheep. With many safe harbors and a convenient location, Crete became a wealthy sea power, trading with mainland Greece, Egypt, the Near East, and Anatolia, thus acquiring the ores necessary for producing bronze. Between about 1900 BCE and 1375 BCE, a distinctive culture flourished on Crete. The British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans named it Minoan after the legend of Minos, a king who had ruled from the capital, Knossos. According to this legend, a half-man, half-bull monster called the Minotaur, son of the wife of King Minos and a bull belonging to the sea god Poseidon, lived at Knossos in a maze called the Labyrinth. To satisfy the Minotaur's appetite for human flesh, King Minos ordered the mainland kingdom of Athens to send a yearly tribute of 14 young men and women, a practice that ended when the Athenian hero Theseus killed the beast. Minoan chronology is divided into two main periods, the Old Palace period, from about 1900 to 1700 BCE, and the New Palace period, from around 1700 to 1450 BCE. The Old Palace period, c. 1900, 1700 BCE Minoan civilization remained very much a mystery until 1900 CE, when Sir Arthur Evans began uncovering the buried ruins of the architectural complex at Knossos, on Crete's north coast, that had been occupied in the Neolithic period, then built over with a succession of Bronze Age structures. Architectural complexes like 19th-century excavators before him, Evans called these great architectural complexes palaces. He believed they were occupied by a succession of kings. While some scholars continue to believe that Evans's palaces actually were the residences and administrative centers of hereditary rulers, the evidence has suggested to others that Minoan society was not ruled by kings drawn from a royal family, but by a confederation of aristocrats or aristocratic families who established a fluid and evolving power hierarchy. In this light, some scholars interpret these elaborate complexes not primarily as residences, but as sites of periodic religious ceremony or ritual, perhaps enacted by a community that gathered within the courtyards that are their core architectural feature. The walls of early Minoan buildings were made of rubble and mud bricks faced with cut and finished local stone, our first evidence of dressed stone used as a building material in the Aegean. Columns and other interior elements were made of wood. Both in large complexes and in the surrounding towns, timber appears to have been used for framing and bracing walls. Its strength and flexibility would have minimized damage from the earthquakes common to the area. Nevertheless, an earthquake in c. 1700 BCE severely damaged buildings at several sites, including Knossos and Phaistos. Ceramic arts. During the Old Palace period, Minoans developed elegant new types of ceramics, spurred in part by the introduction of the potter's wheel early in the 2nd millennium BCE. One type is called Kamar's ware, after the cave on Mount Ida overlooking the architectural complex at Phaistos, in southern Crete, where it was first discovered. The hallmarks of this select ceramic ware, so sought after that it was exported as far away as Egypt and Syria, were its extreme thinness, its use of color, and its graceful, stylized, painted decoration. An example from about 1900 BC has a globular body and a beaked pouring spout, fig. Created from brown, red, and creamy white pigments on a black body, the bold, curving forms, derived from plant life, that decorate this jug seem to swell with its bulging contours. The New Palace period, c. 1700–1450 BCE. The early architectural complex at Knossos, erected about 1900 BCE, formed the core of an elaborate new one built after a terrible earthquake shook Crete in circa 1700 BCE. This rebuilding, at Knossos and elsewhere, belonged to the period termed New Palace by scholars, many of whom consider it the highest point of Minoan civilization. In its heyday, the Knossos complex covered 6 acres, fig. Damaged structures were repaired and enlarged, and the resulting new complexes shared a number of features. Multi-storied, flat-roofed, and with many columns, they were designed to maximize light and air, as well as to define access and circulation patterns. Daylight and fresh air entered through staggered levels, open stairwells, and strategically placed air shafts and light wells, fig. Large, central courtyards, not audience halls or temples, were the most prominent components of these rectangular complexes. Suites of rooms were arranged around them. Corridors and staircases led from the central and subsidiary courtyards, through apartments, ritual areas, and storerooms. Walls were coated with plaster, and some were painted with murals. Floors were plaster, or plaster mixed with pebbles, stone, wood, or beaten earth. The residential quarters had many luxuries: sunlit courtyards or light wells, richly colored murals, and sophisticated plumbing systems. Workshops clustered around the complexes formed commercial centers. Storeroom walls were lined with enormous clay jars for oil and wine, and in their floors stone-lined pits from earlier structures had been designed. For the storage of grain, the huge scale of the centralized management of foodstuffs became apparent when excavators at Knossos found in a single storeroom enough ceramic jars to hold 20,000 gallons of olive oil. The labyrinth at Knossos, because double-axe motifs were used in its architectural decoration, the Knossos Palace was referred to in later Greek legends as the Labyrinth, meaning the house of the double axes. The organization of the complex seemed so complicated that the word labyrinth eventually came to mean maze and became part of the Minotaur legend. This complicated layout provided the complex with its own internal security system, a baffling array of doors leading to unfamiliar rooms, stairs, yet more corridors, or even dead ends. Admittance could be denied by blocking corridors, and some rooms were accessible only from upper terraces. Close analysis, however, shows that the builders had laid out a square grid following predetermined principles, and that the apparently confusing layout may partially be the result of earthquake destruction and rebuilding over the centuries. In typical Minoan fashion, the rebuilt Knossos complex was organized around a large central courtyard, CFIG. A few steps led from the central courtyard down into the so-called throne room to the west, and a great staircase on the east side descended to the Hall of the Double Axes, an unusually grand example of a Minoan hall. This hall and others were supported by the uniquely Minoan-type wooden columns that became standard in Aegean palace architecture. CFIG. The tree trunks from which the columns were made were inverted so that they tapered toward the bottom. The top, supporting massive roof beams and a broad flattened capital, was wider than the bottom. Rooms, following earlier tradition, were arranged around a central space rather than along an axis, as we have seen in Egypt and will see in mainland Greece. During the New Palace period, suites functioned as archives, business centers, and residences. Some must also have had a religious function, though the temples, shrines, and elaborate tombs seen in Egypt are not found in Minoan architecture. Bull leaping at Knossos. Minoan painters worked on a large scale, covering entire walls of rooms with geometric borders, views of nature, and scenes of human activity. Murals can be painted on a still wet plaster surface or a dry one. The wet technique binds pigments to the wall, but forces the painter to work very quickly. On a dry wall, the painter need not hurry, but the pigments tend to flake off over time. Minoans used both techniques. Minoan wall painting displays elegant drawing, and, like Egyptian painters, Minoan painters filled these linear contours with bright and unshaded fields of pure color. They preferred profile or full-faced views, and they turned natural forms into decorative patterns through stylization. One of the most famous paintings of Knossos depicts one of the most prominent subjects in Minoan art, bull leaping, Fig. The panel, restored from excavated fragments, is one of a group of paintings with bulls as subjects from a room in the east wing of the complex. The action, perhaps representing an initiation or fertility ritual, shows three scantily clad youths around a gigantic dappled bull, which is charging in the flying gallop pose. The pale-skinned person at the right, her paleness probably identifying her as a woman, is prepared to catch the dark-skinned man in the midst of his leap, and the pale-skinned woman at the left grasps the bull by its horns, perhaps to help steady it, or perhaps preparing to begin her own vault. Framing the action are strips of overlapping shapes, filled with ornaments set within striped bands. Statuette of a male figure from Palicastro. Surviving Minoan sculpture consists mainly of small, finely executed work in wood, ivory, precious metals, stone, and ceramic. Faience female figurines holding serpents are among the most characteristic images and may have been associated with water, regenerative power, and protection of the home. But among the most impressive works is an unusually large male figure that has been reconstructed from hundreds of fragments excavated in eastern Crete at Palicastro between 1987 and 1990, Fig. The blackened state of the remains bears witness to damage in a fire that must have destroyed the building where it was kept, since fire damage pervades the archaeological layer in which these fragments were found. The cause or meaning of this fire is a mystery. This statuette is a multimedia work assembled from a variety of mostly precious materials. The majority of the body was carved in exquisite anatomical detail, including renderings of subcutaneous veins, tendons, and bones, from the ivory of two hippopotamus teeth, with a gap in the lower torso for a wooden insert to which was attached a kilt made of gold foil. Miniature gold sandals slipped onto the small, tapering feet. The head was carved of gray serpentine with inset eyes of rock crystal, just as inlaid wooden nipples detail the figure's torso. The ivory and gold may have been imported, perhaps from Egypt, but the style is characteristically Minoan. Compare Fig. We know very little about the context and virtually nothing about the meaning or use of this figure, but the nature of the materials and the large size suggest that it was important. Some have interpreted this as the cult statue of a young god, others have proposed it was a votive effigy for a religious ceremony, but these remain speculations. Stone Writons, almost certainly of ritual significance, are a series of stone Writons, vessels used for pouring liquids, that Minoans carved from steatite and serpentine. These have been found in fragments and reconstructed by archaeologists. The Harvester Writon was a cone-shaped vessel barely 4 inches in diameter, fig. It may have been covered with gold leaf, sheets of hammered gold. A rowdy procession of 27 men has been crowded onto its curving surface. The piece is exceptional for the freedom with which the figures occupy three-dimensional space, overlapping and jostling one another instead of marching in orderly, patterned single file across the surface in the manner of some Near Eastern or Egyptian art. The exuberance of the scene is especially notable in the emotions expressed on the men's faces. They march and chant to the beat of a sistrum, a rattle-like percussion instrument, elevated in the hands of a man whose wide-open mouth seems to signal singing at the top of his lungs. The men have large, bold features and sinewy bodies so trim we can see their ribs. One man stands out from the crowd because of his long hair, scale-covered ceremonial cloak, and commanding staff. Is he the leader of this